Political correctness, just the mention of those two words can inspire some really passionate reactions. So what is political correctness? Where did it come from? And how might it be affecting our lives? I'm Mal Fletcher and this is Edges. Nobody's too sure where the term political correctness actually came from, though there are versions of it in the early communist rhetoric of countries like Russia and China. Back then it meant something that was politically on message. Gradually it found its way into left-leaning publications in the West, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. Today we're in Oxford, the home of the famous Oxford Dictionary, and there's no doubt that political correctness is starting to affect the language we use every day. But its influence runs much deeper than that. It's starting to impact almost every area of public behaviour. Some people say it's even impacting the core values of our culture. Today, political correctness has become a kind of umbrella term that covers everything from banning Punch and Judy shows for fear that they might encourage domestic violence, to outlawing Christmas decorations in city streets so as not to offend people of other faiths. When you consider examples like those, it's not hard to see why some journalists have taken to calling political correctness bureaucracy gone mad. If you wanted to see political correctness in its most positive light, you might say it's an attempt to deal with the complexities of life in a pluralistic society. It tries to minimise the possibility of misunderstanding between groups of people who have to live close together, but who have very different views and lifestyles. The problem is that political correctness often sees an offence where no offence was intended or even taken. Political correctness may also be an attempt to deal with the fallout from moral relativism. Most of us, it seems, like the benefits we think come from relativism, being able to do what we want when we want, but we're horrified by its social and emotional consequences. Do your own thing and situation ethics sounded so attractive when they first seeped into public consciousness back in the 1960s. But relativism has left us with unprecedented levels of divorce and crime, while many of our young people try to find joy in a bottle, or to join up with gangs to find a family.
Political correctness affects so many different parts of our lives today. It affects our workplaces, our lifestyles, even the language we use. But is it having a positive impact? I've come to one of London's busiest stations to find out. Can I just ask you what you think of political correctness and why?
Yeah, sure. I think it's an important tool for society, which I think can sometimes be overused.
Meanings are taken out of context just to please smaller minorities.
I think it can be taken too far, really, especially as I work in childcare, and a lot of the things now we're not allowed to do with children because it's politically wrong.
As soon as you tell people how to think, they start behaving against that. It's a bit like kids. You know, when you say don't do that, they'll go and do it. So if you treat people like adults and allow society to develop in a good way, then it will do.
Well, I think you should be more tolerant as a matter of course. I mean, it's live and let live, isn't it?
Load of rubbish, no such thing. Get back to good old basic English.
I think by and large it's incorrect.
From the point of view of making people more tolerant, it doesn't. It makes them less tolerant because it irritates them.
What more can I say without being politically incorrect?
The majority of people I've spoken to today, unsurprisingly, say they've had enough of political correctness. They say it goes too far, and some even said it's making people less, not more, tolerant. Everyone agreed that tolerance is really important though, but many suggested there has to be other ways of achieving it.
Political correctness is also, I think, an attempt to give secularised Western society the values of courtesy, tolerance and respect which were traditionally provided by its Judeo-Christian heritage. But political correctness tries to legislate tolerance, ignoring the fact that things like compassion and respect are actually born in the human soul, and they often come out of deeply held spiritual beliefs. For some people, political correctness represents a new vehicle for social transformation. With the fall of communism and hardcore socialism, many people on the hard left of politics were left looking for a new way to promote their vision, a vision of an equitable society based on purely secular principles. Two of the most powerful social forces in Western culture today are pluralism and secularism. Pluralism says that all notions of truth are equally true, all lifestyles are equally valid, and all roads lead to the same destination. Secularism removes the sacred from society. It says that religious principles should never be used to help shape public policy. It's the marriage of pluralism and secularism that's given birth to political correctness. But some social commentators say that this marriage is also weakening our ability to think critically, to apply reason to problem situations. Critical thinking involves being able to see the principles behind an argument and to decipher whether they're consistent or not. Pluralism, when it's divorced from spiritual values, can lead to a form of cultural schizophrenia. If we're not careful, we can end up saying with great conviction that we actually believe in two completely contradictory things at the same time. It's almost as if we're trying to read the map of society's future with a compass that says north is in two completely different directions. And that can tear a society apart. I visited Steve Chalk MBE, founder of Oasis Trust and FaithWorks, to talk about issues like political correctness. Steve is a social activist, speaker and author, and has strong views on the challenge of living in a politically correct society. Just coming to one of your books for a moment, and you say this in the book, the challenge for the church is to learn to live with the shift from a culture where we had power to one where we need to work hard to find influence. What's the fundamental difference between power and influence, and how do Christians, how does the church begin to make the shift that you're talking about?
I think the church can begin to make that shift just by waking up and reading the newspaper. Actually, do you know, we're not in power anymore. We still pretend like we're in power. I demand my rights. Well, if you read the New Testament, Paul, Peter, James, John, they never had any rights. They didn't believe they had any rights. They were in prison. Paul writes a number of his letters actually in chains. There were no rights. What you had to do was win influence. And you won influence by allowing the life of Christ to radiate through you and out from you. So, in the end, the church won favour, not because they could force people into going their way and going to church and not blaspheming against them, but because in the end they won favour with the people who said, see how these Christians love one another and love us. Look at the way they're involved. I believe that that is the pathway for the church in the future. We are post-Christian as a society. They talk about post-Christendom, don't they, long term, but it simply means get used to the fact that things are more like they used to be in the pages of the New Testament than they have been for the last several centuries across most of the world. We're not in power anymore, but actually that gives us a great opportunity.
You've talked in the Trust book, I think, about how in British culture legislation went from supporting equal opportunity to protecting equality and this word diversity. And you actually say that diversity is a very big opportunity for the church. Of course, for many people, I think words like diversity and plurality and pluralism sound like code for more liberal lifestyles, family breakdown and so on, all that's bad in society.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Yeah. Diversity is a wonderful thing because iron sharpens iron. Helmut Thielicke, great theologian, he said the gospel has to continually be forwarded to a new address because the recipient has moved. What he's saying is society is constantly changing, language is changing, culture's changing, philosophy's changing, outlook's changing, art is changing, thinking is changing, and our task is to constantly bring the good news of Christ to bear on a forever changing situation. Well, how can you do that unless you're engaged in the ongoing rigorous debate about what that is?
I think we saw the weakness of unbridled pluralism in 9/11 and the 7/7 bombings in London. After events like these, people become aware again that good and evil are not just vague, abstract ideas, that some things are right just because they're right, that some of life's biggest choices are not both and choices, they're either or choices. Pluralism has changed, I think weakened, the sense of morality we share as a society. These days we're surrounded by a constant stream of lifestyle options and choices, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. So when we come face to face with the really big moral and ethical questions facing society, it's easy to say, look, I just don't have the resources to deal with all of this. It's too complicated. Just do whatever. These days we face the dual threats of moral relativism on one side and radical Islamist fanaticism on the other. We just can't afford to let go of the moral and spiritual values that have made our culture strong. We're foolish to throw these things away on the flimsy pretext that we might, just might, offend someone who thinks differently. Diversity brings some real benefits to society, but it needs boundaries. Freedom always presupposes an underlying order, otherwise there's chaos. When you get into your car, you don't consciously think about which side of the road you're going to drive on. You just assume that if you're on the correct side, you will have freedom. People can't just drive on whichever side they want, because if we don't all live within the boundaries, none of us are free. Traditionally, I think, any real tolerance in Western culture is heavily influenced by its Judeo-Christian heritage. The life and example of Jesus Christ have inspired so much about what is great in our civilization, from its arts, its literature, its music, even its law and ethics. In the Christian worldview, the gold standard of tolerance is Jesus Christ himself, although those of us who claim to be his followers haven't always lived up to that standard. In the Christian heritage, Jesus Christ himself was often surrounded by dissenters, people who disagreed with his message or what he stood for, often violently so. He issued a very strong polemic. At a spiritual level, he said, there is only one path to truth. And yet, throughout his ministry, he remained committed to conversion through persuasion and never coercion. But Jesus was no easy touch. The same man who would freely heal people's diseases would often say things like, now go your way and don't sin anymore. He showed us that it is possible to be gracious to people without, by our silence, giving tacit approval to their actions if we believe they're wrong or unhealthy. There is such a thing as speaking the truth in love. Has political correctness gone too far? We join a group of friends in London as they discuss the issue.
I'm married to a black man whose parents originated from the Caribbean, and I haven't experienced any sort of racism as yet. We haven't been married long, and I'm sure at some point there will be, but to be able to hear somebody say nigger is absolutely horrendous. Even the word coloured, I think even the word coloured, people just, sometimes politically correctness, it actually does work right, because it actually teaches people how not to be offensive to people and setting a standard.
I think we've gone too far, because where I come from in Colombia, you can call people in Spanish el negro, the black guy, the small little black guy, the black woman. Why would you do that? And it's just a general term, just like we call people the thin person, the chubby person.
That's a different meaning though, isn't it? If you're translating negro as nigger, that's not the same.
No, it's not, okay, it's not quite the same, but it's actually accepted when nobody's treading on toes. It's the context, it's how you said it, it's what you meant behind it.
But it's probably also because of the history, because of the England has the, it's a different history than Colombia, and they had dealings with black people, obviously with all the slave trade and all that, which all obviously brings all that history back, if you would use that name, whilst in Colombia you wouldn't have that necessarily. I mean, I come from Germany, and I think it's not as a big issue as you describing it here, that it would be.
But why can't a white person say, in a friendly way, nigger?
Because it's so offensive. Because the term is about when black people were slaves to white people, when and they're no longer slaves
So are
to
rings.
us.
So are rings.
No, hold on. They're no longer slaves to us. So why would you say something that's going to demean someone to make them feel small? To try, it's just a power thing. It's about pride. By calling someone a nigger, you're just being proud and wanting to make them feel small. So you've got power in a social situation.
How many people know that it actually goes back to the history of the word? Goes back to how many people know that a wedding ring is something that goes back to slavery?
It's a sign of cool.
Not that many people.
It's education in school. We all, at school, I've learned about black slavery, not to call people niggers, and I've seen harsh punishments for people who have used those terms. It's just completely unacceptable.
In some places today, the values that Christianity gave us are being replaced by human rights law. In fact, one writer said that human rights are probably as significant now as the Bible once was in shaping Western values. The idea that human beings have rights is actually fundamental to Christian belief. In the Genesis story, when God created humankind, He gave us the rights to dignity and equality. These came from God, not from UN mandates or EU treaties. And in the Bible tradition, with these rights came human responsibilities. Sadly, some modern human rights law seems to downplay responsibilities. Sometimes, for example, it focuses on the rights and interests of minorities without giving equal weight to their obligations to the dominant culture in which they live. Politicians, lawyers and judges are just as human as the rest of us, and if they're not held accountable to the higher spiritual principles on which our legal system was built, we may end up with a situation where minorities are preferred over majorities. Some people think that's already happening. Now, this encourages two things. First of all, in the majority group, there's a sense of quiet frustration, a sense that their values are being laid aside or trampled underfoot. Meanwhile, the minority group starts to think of themselves as perpetual victims. And that's not healthy because it kills the kind of confidence people need to change their own situation. Adrian Owens is a spokesman for the campaign against political correctness. He also works as a health and safety consultant and, along the way, helps to raise his 9 children. The campaign's aim is to raise awareness of the implications of political correctness for society as a whole, but one of its most frequent methods is humour.
One of the political correctness stories I've been involved in recently was a case just in a village a couple of miles from here, where the shopkeeper was selling some golly dolls, and some customer must have reported him, because the first thing he knew was the police suddenly swooped on him. 2 police officers questioned him, confiscated the dolls as potential evidence, and said that he was likely that he had committed an offence under the Public Order Act. Of course, this made local news, and I got involved and made a statement saying that I thought this was the police had lost all sense of proportion. We have a lot of serious crime around here in Lancashire, and here they were spending their time persecuting, I think, this shopkeeper. The nice part of the story was it got a lot of publicity. It went into the national press. He sold out of golly dolls in 1 week. 150 of them went. Another one I like, it's someone I know, he's now a Member of Parliament, and he's the main spokesman for the campaign against political correctness in Parliament, a chap called Philip Davis, an MP over in Yorkshire. But he used to work for Asda, and if you go into Asda and go to the meat counter, you'll find the sausages there, and they have a brand of sausages called thick Irish sausages, and he worked on sort of public relations with them, and got this phone call from a very irate customer one day complaining about the fact that this was insulting the whole of the Irish nation because he were calling them thick. And of course it took him a long time to explain that actually the word thick related to the sausages, not to people from Ireland. But this is the sort of thinking that political correctness starts to get even the most ordinary, perfectly nice people into. They start to lose common touch with reality and common sense.
One of the things we do as the campaign is we do pull a lot of these funny stories together into, we've done a scrapbook and we're about to launch another one, because humour is one of the best weapons you've got. But you laugh, but then you sort of laugh and then you cry and you think, no, there's all this waste, the waste of the police time with the golly dolls, the fact that someone as is having to answer questions from people complaining about the thick Irish sausages, you know, it is bad enough, but then you've got the more worrying sides of it, such as the fact that, you know, Christmas is getting pushed out and we're getting Winter Festival and things like that. So it has its funny side and it has its darker side. People are very conscious about what they say and will say something that they don't believe is true for fear of offending someone else. And that's a natural reaction, and in some ways that's good, but political correctness tends to tell people you must not say this, you must not say that. It also extends into the fields of equality and diversity where, for good intentions, we've said we do not wish to discriminate against minorities in this country, whether on grounds of race or sex or religion. And that's good, but we feel a lot of the consequences of that have been unintended and negative. What I'm trying to do about this issue is to encourage people to be confident enough to challenge and stand up and say, no, this is not what we believe in, this is not what we subscribe to. I did a radio interview recently on a local radio station here in Merseyside. And it was one of these phone-in programs, and the people who come on who feel confident then because they hear someone like me, I'm just a spokesman for the campaign, expressing very many of the things that they feel, but perhaps they've been nervous about coming forward and saying. I think it's truth, really, that motivated me to get involved in this campaign. Political correctness often stops people telling the truth. Yes, there are ways to tell the truth, and we must always tell the truth with charity as Christians. It mustn't be a harsh truth, it must be truth with love. But we mustn't be afraid of telling the truth. St. John's Gospel says, you know, Moses brought the law, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And I think we need to step back and not always try and use the law as the way to alter people's behaviour. I'm not in favour of discrimination. I'm all for supporting minorities to be part of our society and culture. I just think we need to find a different way of doing it, not the blunt instrument of law, Moses, but really the instruments of grace and truth, Jesus Christ.
Political correctness wants to turn the whole of society into a more level playing field. And that's a good thing. We all want to live in a more equitable, just society. But focusing on the interests of minority groups and stacking the rules in their favour might lead us to a situation where we create new minorities. Minority groups need to be respected, but that doesn't necessarily mean changing majority values to suit them. In the midst of all of this, there are groups that would like to undermine the traditional values on which society was built, because those values don't support their particular lifestyle. And they'll often use a strategy that starts with changing public perceptions and ends with changing policy. First off, they'll promote the idea that they speak for a completely homogenous community, a group of people who all think and believe the same things, even if that group is very diversified or even fragmented. Secondly, they'll try to establish themselves as a victim group, playing up stories of their mistreatment at the hand of the majority. Sympathy is, after all, a very powerful change agent. They'll also try to influence the judicial and political processes, often using human rights as their ticket. They'll often argue from small isolated cases to much larger general principles. They'll use the possibility of one-off worst-case scenarios to justify sweeping changes to existing laws. And then they'll use the new laws to prevent any possibility of dissent, so that people can't return to past values. Many of these more militant groups, whether they're motivated by politics or religion or sexual orientation, will say that their only real goal is to promote a live and let live approach to life. And yet I think the real agenda, when they're prepared to admit it, is to see their particular view of morality become the norm throughout society. They'd like to live in a world where they and other people like them are the majority. I guess that's human nature.
Political correctness attempts to encourage tolerance, especially towards minority groups. But does it go too far and favour those groups unfairly? Well, I'm here in London, a truly multicultural city, to find out what people think. Excuse me, madam, can I just ask you about political correctness and whether you think it favours the minority groups too much?
I would say it doesn't, because it's important to support the minority groups, and if you don't give that extra bias, then the majority can easily trample over the minority without realising it is.
We know lots of minorities who get focus on their particular problems, and I think it's totally wrong.
As far as I know, there's never been a time in England where there hasn't been a whole load of battles going on between loads of different people. That's what makes England as great as it is.
If you're white, Anglo-Saxon and male, you're pretty at the bottom of the pecking order.
The whites are not getting their rights, so all the rest of them are.
There are times when we actually need to highlight the situations or the plight of people who feel oppressed.
We should all treat each other as equals, and we shouldn't start labelling each other.
So opinion on the issue is really split. Some people say political correctness is so important for those minority groups to be able to get their voices heard in society. Others completely disagree and say, why should they get their voices heard in society? They're a minority group, they shouldn't be able to have all this influence over everybody. Others still say that neither the majority or the minority groups are benefiting at all from political correctness.
The bottom line, I think, is that political correctness might be trying to build the kind of kingdom Jesus spoke so much about without making place for its rightful king. During his wilderness temptation experience, Jesus was offered the opportunity to rule over all the kingdoms of men. But he refused to be distracted from his core mission, which was to rule first not on the thrones of men, but in their hearts. Before societies can change for the better, we must change. The biggest issues of our time are issues of the human heart and soul. We won't see an end to poverty unless we can heal the greed in the human soul. We won't see an end to global warming unless we can deal with the selfishness of the human heart. These things and others like them are not changed by passing laws alone. It's the human heart that needs to be changed most of all. That's why Jesus requires that his followers fulfill a two-sided mandate. The first side is that we try to win others to faith, not by coercion, but by loving persuasion and example. The second part of this calling is that we try to redeem and reshape the culture around us by being salt and light, a positive influence. We must get involved in the issues that will shape the future of our society, but we must do it in the spirit of Christ, not judgmentally but positively, and with a firm conviction that what the Scripture says is actually true, that righteousness does enhance and lift up a nation. Perhaps you have some ideas on how we can build a more equitable and just society for everyone. Or maybe you've been on the receiving end of some negative political correctness. We'd love to hear from you. You can drop us an email, the address is mal@edges.tv, or you can write to us through our website, that's edges.tv. Until next time, I'm Mal Fletcher, and you've been watching Edges.